Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Ambassador Danon will deliver a brief statement ahead of this afternoon's Security Council meeting. He will take your questions afterwards. Please remember, if you're called to ask a question, to announce your name and your news outlet. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. Early this morning, the Israeli Air Forces carried out a strike that eliminated Ibrahim Akil, one of Hezbollah's most senior military commanders and member of their Jihad Council. Since 2004, he has served as the head of Hezbollah's operations unit, in which he was responsible for Hezbollah's bombing attacks, anti-tank missile attacks, air defense, and other military fields. Akil was one of the most wanted men on the planet, with a $7 million reward on his head for the 1983 bombing of the US Embassy in Beirut and other terror attacks. He was responsible for the murder of hundreds of Americans, and Israel served him the justice he so richly deserved. On October 8th, while Israeli civilians were still being slaughtered in the south by Hamas, Hezbollah unleashed hundreds of rockets at our civilians in the north. Since that day, Hezbollah has launched over 8,000 rockets at our civilians. They have forced over 60,000 people to flee their homes, becoming refugees in their own country. You can look at this image, which shows Hezbollah's Radwan force scouting our communities. I refer you to Resolution 1701, that they should not be next to our border. And look, you can see the Radwan actually on the fence with Israel, planning a similar attack like we had coming from Gaza on October 7th. Their sole purpose is to carry out a similar attack against Israeli civilians in the north. If Hezbollah is not pushed back from our border to north of the Litani River through diplomatic efforts, Israel will be left with no choice but to use any means within our rights to defend our citizens and enable the evacuees of the north to return to their homes. Thank you.
Ambassador, it's Pamela Falk from U.S. News and World Report. Do you see any possibilities during UNGA for backroom, back-channel talks or any kind of talks on Lebanon? And what's next in Lebanon? Thank you.
Well, I hope so. Today, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Lebanon will join us in the Security Council, and I hope he will speak about Hezbollah. And I call the parties to act now before it's too late, because we don't want to see escalation in the region. We have no intention to enter a war with Hezbollah and Lebanon, but we cannot continue the way it is. So I will call them to be involved and try to find a diplomatic solution that will bring us to a situation where we enforce Resolution 1701.
Ambassador, this is Shudeja with China Central Television. There are a lot of speculations on, the communication device explosions. Can you confirm whether Israel is behind this or not?
So we are not commenting on the specific attacks you mentioned, but I can tell you that we will do everything we can to target those terrorists, to minimize casualties to civilians, but we prefer the diplomatic way.
Is there any updates on the possible meeting between Mr. Antonio Guterres and Prime Minister Netanyahu?
So, because of the situation, we don't know what will be the schedule of the Prime Minister. He will not arrive on Tuesday like he's scheduled. It's postponed now, and we will follow what's happening in Israel. We will know when he's coming and if he's coming.
Ambassador Stefano Vaccara, Slovenia, New York, Ital Press. There is something that you expect that UNIFIL do that didn't do yet. I mean, what is your opinion about how the UN mission did so far in this crisis?
So we think UNIFIL should do more. They will not fight Hezbollah. Let's be realistic about it. But we expect them to report the violations of Resolution 1701 especially when they can see Hezbollah terrorists next to UNIFIL bases. And I have shown the Security Council previously that Hezbollah is putting the rocket launchers next to UNIFIL bases. So we expect UNIFIL, if they cannot push them, at least report what they are seeing.
Ambassador, yes, in Al news, Israel always talk about the civilians and how they protect themselves. And we restrict all the civilians around the world. But what about the thousands Israel killed every day? Now over 40,000 or even more, and everywhere now in Gaza, in Rafah, and nowadays in Lebanon.
We are a peaceful nation. We didn't start this war. It was forced upon us. I think the blame is on the shoulder of Hamas. They are the one who actually attacked Israel. They are the one who are keeping, as we speak, 101 hostages, including babies and women, so they can end this war. They can release the hostages, and we can have a ceasefire. So I think the blame is not on us. We regret the loss of life of any civilian. But when you fight a terrorist organization who is hiding behind civilians, it is a problem.
Mr. Ambassador, I don't have a question. I have to say, my name is Samar Nader from Lebanon. Congratulations for today for killing Israel, and congratulations for killing 5 kids added to the 10,000 kids of Gaza. Thank you.
I will send you a message to the people of Lebanon. The people of Lebanon should speak up today against Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is hijacking the people of Lebanon, dragging them into escalation. And I think, even though it's hard for you maybe to say it here, what you really think about Hezbollah. I know it's hard for many Lebanese, but I call them to speak up and try to do whatever they can to avoid the escalation. Please.
Ambassador, Jessica from France Interpol. If we had a situation where personal communications devices were booby-trapped in Israel and civilians were killed due to that, would you classify that as a war crime?
Well, when you look at the intention of whom we target, you realize that we target terrorists, period. And when you target terrorists, according to international law, you can target terrorists, even if they are hiding behind civilians. We do whatever we can to minimize casualties, and we use, without referring to what you said, we do use sophisticated weapons in order to target the terrorists and not the civilians around them. One more question, please.
Maria Romani with the Iran International News Channel. The Iranian ambassador to Islamic Republic of Iran, Amir Saeed Iravani, said that they would follow up on the attack on the ambassador in Lebanon and also asked the Security Council and the Secretary General to take action against attacks in their Israel. What's your reaction to this statement from the representative of Islam?
Well, I'm looking forward to hear him speaking at the council within an hour or so, and I would be very happy to hear him saying what I'm saying now, that we want to prevent escalation in Lebanon. I don't think the Iranians really care about what's happening in Lebanon. I think they are using the Lebanese people. They are using Lebanon as a launching pad against Israel, and I think the Lebanese people should stand up against that. Thank you very much.
meeting. Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. Mr. Volker Türk, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Mr. President, thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council on the situation in Lebanon and the region, including the most recent alarming developments. For nearly a year, Hezbollah and other non-state armed groups in Lebanon and the Israel Defense Forces have exchanged fire across the blue line on an almost daily basis. These exchanges have been in repeated breach of the cessation of hostilities and in violation of Resolution 1701. Strikes and exchanges of fire have expanded in scope and intensity, and in some cases reached much deeper into Lebanese and Israeli territory. Over 100,000 people have been displaced from southern Lebanon. At least 60,000 have been displaced from northern Israel. The exchanges of fire have caused numerous casualties, including among civilians, and significant damage to homes, civilian infrastructure, and agricultural land on both sides of the blue line. The risk of further expansion of this cycle of violence is extremely serious and poses a grave threat to the stability of Lebanon, Israel, and the whole region. Mr. President, on the afternoon of 17 September, many communication devices, or pagers, primarily used by members of Hezbollah, exploded simultaneously across Lebanon. Similar explosions were also reported in Syria. The following day, a second wave of explosions, smaller in scale but more lethal, was reported throughout the same areas of Lebanon. This time, the devices involved were two-way handheld radios reportedly used by Hezbollah. Devices exploded in homes, cars, supermarkets, and streets. Lebanon's Ministry of Public Health stated that 37 people were killed, including 2 children, and more than 3,400 people were injured in the successive explosions. Medical professionals and hospitals are working around the clock to help the wounded. Lebanese society, old and young, have been in profound shock and panic. The Lebanese government has strongly denounced the attack, which it attributed to Israel. Caretaker Prime Minister Mikati said, and I quote, "It represented a serious violation of Lebanese sovereignty and a crime," end quote. In a speech on 19 September, Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah said in response to the attacks that Israel exceeded all limits, laws, and red lines. And he vowed, and I quote, "to exact a heavy price and a fair punishment," end quote. He reiterated that the Lebanon front would only stop once the aggression on Gaza ended. In a letter to the President of the Security Council on 18 September, the Islamic Republic of Iran blamed Israel for the explosions. Noting that its ambassador to Lebanon was among those wounded, Iran stated that it, and I quote again, "reserves its right under international law to take required measures deemed necessary to respond to such a heinous crime and violation," end quote. To date, the government of Israel has made no official comment on these developments. Mr. President, since the explosions on 17 and 18 September, exchanges of fire across the blue line have continued, showing worrying signs of escalation. The exchanges include some of the heaviest bombardment of southern Lebanon since 8 October 2023. Israeli aircraft have conducted a high number of airstrikes and overflights, including breaking the sound barrier over Beirut on several occasions. In addition, we are receiving initial reports about an Israeli airstrike in the southern suburbs of Beirut hours ago, which Israel said targeted and killed a number of senior Hezbollah leaders. The Lebanese Health Ministry said at least 12 people were killed and over 60 injured in the strike. Meanwhile, heavy barrages of rocket, drone, artillery, and anti-tank missile fire from Lebanon have killed 2 IDF soldiers and wounded 10 Israelis. UNIFIL is monitoring the situation closely. On 16 September, Israel's Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, suggested that the center of gravity was moving north, including the transfer of military forces. Speaking of the onset of a, quote, new phase of war, end quote, he suggested the only way left to ensure the return of Israel's northern communities to their homes was through military action. Reports from Israeli media indicate that Israel Defense Forces 98th Division was transferred from Gaza to the Northern Command, adding to concerns about the risk of further escalation on the horizon. From Lebanon, UN Special Coordinator Hennes Plekar has been in constant contact with all concerned actors, including caretaker Prime Minister Mikati, Foreign Minister Mr. Bou Habib, Speaker of Parliament Nabi Berri, and their offices and other authorities. In her meetings, she's continued to push for a diplomatic solution and warned against further escalation. She continues to underscore that military advances would not restore stability or enable displaced civilians on both sides of the Blue Line to return home safely. She will travel to Israel early next week for consultations with relevant counterparts. Mr. President, in the current fragile regional context, the devastating war in Gaza continues. Nearly a year after the horrific atrocities committed by Hamas on 7 October, Israeli military operations, including bombardment from the air and land and armed exchanges with Hamas and other militants, continue across the Strip. The number of fatalities tragically keeps increasing. More than 41,000 Palestinians have been killed, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health, many of them children. At the same time, the indiscriminate launching of rockets by Hamas and other armed groups toward population centers in Israel also continues. I once again echo the words of the Secretary General. We need an immediate ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages, and a massive scale-up of humanitarian aid to Gaza. The risk to security and stability, not only in Lebanon, but also in the region, could not be clearer or graver. The Secretary General has already expressed his deep alarm over these events. I echo his sentiments and strongly urge all actors to exercise maximum restraint to avert any further escalation. They must abide by their obligations under international law concerning the protection of civilians. I also strongly urge member states with influence over the parties to leverage it now. As we approach a full year of near-daily exchanges of fire across the Blue Line and bloodshed in Gaza, too many lives have been lost, too many people have been displaced, and too many livelihoods have been destroyed. But if things continue as they are, we risk seeing a conflagration that could dwarf even the devastation and suffering witnessed so far. It's not too late to avoid such folly. There is still room for diplomacy, which must be used without delay. The Secretary General continues to urgently call on the parties to recommit to the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701 and immediately return to a cessation of hostilities. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Volker Türk.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies. I'm appalled by the breadth and impact of the attacks on 17 and 18 September in Lebanon on civilians, where the explosion of pagers, two-way radios, and other electronic devices have reportedly killed at least 37 people, including 2 children, and injured more than 3,400 people in Lebanon alone, leaving many with permanent disabilities, and healthcare facilities struggling to cope with the magnitude of the impact on people. These attacks represent a new development in warfare, where communication tools become weapons, simultaneously exploding across marketplaces, on street corners, and in homes as daily life unfolds. Authorities have reportedly dismantled unexploded devices in universities, banks, and hospitals. This has unleashed widespread fear, panic, and horror among people in Lebanon, already suffering in an increasingly volatile situation since October 2023 and crumbling under a severe and long-standing economic crisis. This cannot be the new normal. Mr. President, war has rules for each and every party to this and any other armed conflict. Armed force, that is, violence against other human beings, can only be used where necessary to achieve a valid military objective. In doing so, the fundamental distinction between civilian and military targets must be front and center. All feasible precautions must be taken to spare civilians. Attacks must remain proportional to the wider damage they inflict. Persons not exercising a continuous combat function in an armed group can only be targeted when taking a direct part in hostilities. At their core, these rules have the paramount aim of effectively protecting civilians. International human rights law exists to protect the equality and dignity of every human being, even in times of war. Law exists to defend values central to our societies and to our world. Simultaneous targeting of thousands of individuals, whether civilians or members of armed groups, without knowledge as to who was in possession of the targeted devices, their location, and their surroundings at the time of the attack, violates international human rights law and, as applicable, international humanitarian law. It is difficult to conceive how, in these circumstances, such attacks could possibly conform with the key principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attack under international humanitarian law. If the attacker is unable to assess the compliance of the attack with binding rules of international law, notably the likely impact on civilians, then the attack should not be carried out. International humanitarian law prohibits the use of booby-trap devices in the form of apparently harmless portable objects which are specifically designed and constructed to contain explosive material. It is a war crime to commit violence intended to spread terror among civilians. I call again for an independent, thorough, and transparent investigation into the circumstances of these explosions. Those who ordered and carried out these attacks must be held to account. Let me be clear. This method of warfare may be new and unfamiliar, but international humanitarian and human rights law apply regardless and must be upheld. These attacks occurred amidst hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah, which since 8 October last year have caused civilian casualties on both sides. According to the Lebanese Ministry of Health, figures that were released in August, over 500 people have been killed, over 2,400 injured, and according to IOM, over 110,000 displaced in Lebanon. The government of Israel reported 48 people killed in Israel and over 63 people displaced in the context of these hostilities. The last 24 hours have seen intensified cross-border military action in Lebanon and Israel. This tragic situation cannot be seen in isolation. It is bound up with the war in Gaza, the spiraling violence in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Israel's continued occupation of Palestinian territory. The heightened risk of further atrocity crimes remains. As repeatedly stated, the humanitarian situation for 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza is catastrophic. Over 1,200 people were killed on 7 October in Israel. In Gaza, over 100 hostages are still held by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. Over 40,200 Palestinians, mostly women and children, have been killed as a result of the intensive Israeli offensive, and over 95,500 injured in Gaza, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health. I'm outraged by this inconceivable toll of human suffering. For the UN and other humanitarian responders, ongoing hostilities, access constraints, attacks on staff and facilities, and damaged infrastructures, along with the deteriorating security situation, including looting and frequent Israeli-issued evacuation orders, are key factors obstructing the delivery of sufficient life-saving aid across the Gaza Strip. Ending the war in Gaza and averting a full-blown regional conflict is an absolute and urgent priority. I call for an immediate ceasefire and for continuous humanitarian access to be ensured throughout the Strip. I urge the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held in Gaza. The arbitrary detention by Israel of thousands of Palestinians must end. The wider situation of illegality across the occupied Palestinian territory, deriving from Israel's policies and practices, as so clearly spelled out by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion in July, must be comprehensively addressed. Mr. President, disrespect for international law is a matter of international peace and security, the core obligation of this Council, with implications beyond these countries and this region, beyond these countries and this region. States have constructed international human rights and humanitarian law precisely for moments like these, when life, dignity, and our very humanity are at risk. As such, states must not, cannot accept blatant disregard for international law, including binding decisions of the Security Council and orders of the International Court of Justice. They must not, cannot allow the hollowing out of international law and its protective core, neither in this nor in any other situation around the world. All states, particularly those with influence, must do everything they can to ensure full respect for international law. Just over 10 days ago, in my address to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, I urged the rejection of a new normal of endless, vicious military escalation and increasingly alarming technologically advanced methods of warfare. The warnings from multiple actors against an all-out war in the region have been clear and consistent. It would benefit no one. Continuing on this path of inflamed war rhetoric on all sides and reckless military escalation only leads to further devastation. I urge Israel and Hezbollah to cease hostilities immediately. The specter of this region's past, the unending cycles of conflict, the human rights grievances and causes of which have been ignored and trampled on, is palpable and omnipresent. The complexity of this moment and the stakes for people everywhere demand much more from the international community to achieve an enduring peace. This crisis requires political courage and leadership. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Turk for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, I thank Mrs. DiCarlo and Mr. Turk for their briefing, and I acknowledge and welcome the presence of His Excellency Minister Abdullah Abu Habib among us in this meeting. My country has called for this urgent meeting in light of the alarming escalation in Lebanon on September 17 and 18. These tragic events have resulted in dozens of deaths and thousands of injuries following the remote detonation of small communication devices across the country. The perpetrator is well known. We strongly condemn this Israelis' attack. Such actions represent a blatant violation of Lebanon's sovereignty, of the UN Charter, of the international law, and of Resolution 1701 and 2749. Algeria stands in full solidarity with Lebanon during these difficult times, and we extend our deepest condolences to the government and to the resilient people of Lebanon. And we commend the Lebanese authorities for their measured and responsible handling of this grave crisis, preventing further escalation. Mr. President, these acts of aggression amount to war crimes. The deliberate and indiscriminate nature of these Israeli strikes has caused terror among civilians, with densely populated areas being targeted. This dangerous precedent turns civilian devices into bombs, threatening the safety of all and posing a significant threat. This precedent opens a dangerous Pandora box. What will happen if such unfamiliar tactics are replicated by terrorist groups? While the international community calls for desescalation, Israel pulls the region toward war, expanding hostilities from the Blue Line into the entire Lebanese territory. The Israeli officials have openly threatened to launch a large-scale war in Lebanon. These attacks were followed by statements, official statements, praising the so-called positive result. The airstrike against Beirut this morning are another proof that the Israeli occupying power is not at all interested in peace. So, do Israeli occupying authorities truly seek peace with their neighbors? Are they genuinely committed to implementing Resolution 2735? Are they really committed to a ceasefire in Gaza? Mr. President, the Security Council bears the solemn responsibility to uphold the principle enshrined in the UN Charter. The Security Council must enforce its resolution. Resolution 1701 must be fully implemented without bias, and the Israeli occupier aggressions must cease, and it must withdraw from all occupied Lebanese territories. Only by ending the occupation that we could pave the way for lasting peace and stability in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you,
Nous saluons la tenue d'une réunion suite au développement extrêmement inquiétant au Liban et au-delà. Et je voudrais remercier la secrétaire générale adjointe DiCarlo ainsi que le haut-commissaire turc pour leurs interventions qui détaillent très précisément les événements de ces derniers jours. Je salue la présence du ministre et bien entendu de tous les collègues. Monsieur le Président, la Suisse exprime sa profonde inquiétude face aux explosions des beepers et d'autres appareils de communication survenus mardi et mercredi. Nous condamnons le fait que ces explosions aient fait de nombreuses victimes parmi les civils, y compris les enfants. La lumière doit être faite sur les circonstances et les responsabilités. Et je tiens à présenter nos sincères condoléances à toutes les familles des victimes civiles ayant été blessées et tuées ces derniers jours. Nous sommes préoccupés par les conséquences plus amples de ces explosions pour la population civile. Elles ont semé la panique et la peur généralisée et engorgé les hôpitaux. À ce titre, je voudrais rendre hommage au personnel hospitalier et aux secouristes libanais pour leur engagement. Ces explosions ainsi que l'intensification des hostilités des deux côtés de la ligne bleue, y inclut la frappe dans la banlieue sud de Beyrouth aujourd'hui, risquent de compromettre davantage la stabilité du Liban et de toute la région. Nous déplorons ici aussi les civils blessés et tués. La Suisse appelle toutes les parties, ainsi que ceux qui ont une influence sur elle, à faire preuve de la plus grande retenue afin d'éviter une escalade régionale majeure. Nous plaidons avec insistance pour un retour à la cessation totale des hostilités et exigeons l'application intégrale de la résolution 1701. Ce Conseil a réaffirmé ses demandes à l'unanimité il y a seulement 3 semaines. La Suisse appelle toutes les parties au respect du droit international humanitaire et notamment des principes de distinction, proportionnalité et précaution en toutes circonstances. War has rules, comme vient de le dire le haut-commissaire. La protection des civils est une obligation juridique qui doit être respectée. Nous rappelons aussi que les droits humains s'appliquent en tout temps. Le seul désir des dizaines de milliers de personnes déplacées des deux côtés de la ligne bleue est de retourner dans leur maison pour y vivre en paix. Leurs enfants, quant à eux, ne demandent rien d'autre que de pouvoir se rendre dans leurs écoles et jouer avec leurs amis. Une chose est pourtant absolument claire. Le dialogue et la désescalade sont les seuls moyens pour y parvenir. L'escalade militaire n'est pas la solution. Elle entraînerait la région dans l'abîme d'une guerre régionale. C'est pourquoi la Suisse soutient tous les efforts de médiation en cours. Des voies de paix et de raison doivent prévaloir dans l'intérêt de la population de toute la région. Enfin, et nous ne cesserons pas d'insister sur ce point, un cessez-le-feu à Gaza, ainsi que la libération des otages et un accès humanitaire rapide et sans entrave sont nécessaires de toute urgence pour réduire les souffrances des civils et éviter une plus grande escalade régionale. Les négociations doivent urgemment se poursuivre et les parties doivent y participer de bonne foi. Ce Conseil doit assumer ses responsabilités et contribuer unis à une solution pacifique. La Suisse est prête à apporter sa contribution. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank UNSC DiCarlo and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, for their grim briefings today. I also welcome the participation of Foreign Minister Mr. Habib and the representatives of Syria, Iran, and Israel in this meeting. The Republic of Korea is shocked to witness the bloody and the devastating attacks in Lebanon, involving communication devices that caused thousands of casualties, including children. This unprecedented action signifies a deeply worrisome escalation in an already extremely volatile context. I would like to make the following points in this regard. First, we stress that under no circumstances can violations of international humanitarian law be tolerated. These indiscriminate attacks remotely targeted and seriously injured thousands of individuals without specific knowledge of who possessed the devices, their exact locations, or their surroundings at the time of the attack, at grocery stores, hospitals, and funerals. Such attacks raise serious concerns about whether the core principles of IHL, distinction, proportionality, and precaution, were upheld during these operations. Reports also indicate that the exploded devices, predominantly pagers and walkie-talkies, were harmless portable products which are prohibited from being used as booby traps under Article 7, Paragraph 2 of the amended Protocol 2 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. This further calls into question the legality of the operations as highlighted by High Commissioner Turk in his briefing. We call on all stakeholders to immediately cease all violations of international humanitarian law. Second, the international community must come together in urgent and serious discussions to address the emerging risks posed by the unprecedented form of warfare witnessed this week. The attacks weaponized thousands of personal communication devices for remote detonated destruction, elucidating the alarming potential for any consumer electronics to be exploited and transformed into lethal weapons that transcend our imaginations. These incidents underscore the urgent need to review whether existing international frameworks are adequately equipped to prevent such abuses. Third, we call on all parties to respect the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Lebanon and accelerate diplomatic efforts to fully implement Resolution 1701 and pursue a long-term solution for durable peace. While the situation is undoubtedly hazardous, this resolution remains a cornerstone of regional stability and is essential for preventing further deterioration. We urge all parties to return to the fundamentals of the resolution, including full respect for the blue line and the establishment of an area free of any armed entities other than the Lebanese armed forces. Fourth, my delegation strongly urges all parties to exercise maximum restraint and prioritize de-escalation during this highly perilous period. Israel has recently added the safe return of displaced northern residents as a new objective of its military action, stating that operations will continue until they can return home. It also conducted airstrikes today in a densely populated area in Beirut, which reportedly killed at least 12 people and injured over 60, including civilians, with others buried under the rubble. Further escalation would probably result in far greater civilian casualties, increased threats to UNIFIL peacekeepers, and unparalleled regional security risks. Indeed, from the Blue Line to Gaza, the West Bank, Yemen, and Syria, the region is on the brink of widespread and massive war. Even a single misstep or miscalculation could trigger a catastrophic situation with grave consequences for the lives of millions that could extend far beyond the region. As we now truly stand at an inflection point, we once again call on all parties to return to the negotiating table with a particular urgency for a ceasefire in Gaza, which lies at the very heart of de-escalation. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Undersecretary General DiCarlo and High Commissioner Turk, for your briefings. Colleagues, the United States remains of the view that a broader conflict in the Middle East is neither desirable nor inevitable. But the actions various actors take in the coming days will, once again, determine how the situation evolves. It is imperative that even as facts emerge about the latest incidents, in which, I reiterate, the United States played no role, all parties refrain from any actions which could plunge the region into a devastating war. Security Council cannot ignore the origins of this particular conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. Prior to Hamas's brutal terrorist attack, quiet had largely been maintained along the Blue Line for 18 years, since the adoption of Resolution 1701 in 2006. This stability was shattered on October 7 and 8, when Israel was attacked without provocation by non-state armed groups in Lebanon. And for the past 11 months, the people of Lebanon have suffered the devastating consequences of this conflict, which is not their own. More than 100,000 Lebanese civilians and more than 65,000 Israeli civilians have been displaced. Civilians on both sides of the Blue Line have seen their homes destroyed and their fields and orchards burned. Hezbollah, which receives extensive training, arms, and financing from Iran, took these actions in solidarity with Hamas, not for Lebanon or the Lebanese people. And for the past 11 months, Hezbollah has continued to bombard communities in northern Israel on a near daily basis, again, in support of Hamas and Iran's broader campaign to threaten Israel. Hezbollah's sustained attacks, presence along the Blue Line, and entrenchment in southern Lebanon also put Israeli and Lebanese civilians at risk. Israel has a right to defend itself against Hezbollah's attacks. No member of this council facing a terrorist organization on its border would tolerate daily rocket attacks on its territory and the displacement of tens of thousands of its people. We expect all parties will comply with international humanitarian law and take all reasonable steps to minimize harm to civilians, especially those in densely populated areas. Continued escalation of the violence across the Blue Line will not create the conditions for displaced Israeli and Lebanese civilians to return to their homes in northern Israel and southern Lebanon. Rather, the United States continues to believe a diplomatic resolution is the only way to create the conditions for displaced Lebanese and Israeli civilians to return to their homes with safety and security. And we will continue to pursue this goal. Iran, through its sustained supply of weapons and personnel to Hezbollah, in blatant disregard and defiance of the call for disarmament in Resolutions 1559 and 1701, and in violation of the latter's legally binding arms embargo, appears to have a different agenda. Over many years, the United States has committed substantial resources to humanitarian efforts in Lebanon and supported independent institutions such as the Lebanese Armed Forces and Internal Security Forces. Equally significant, the Security Council has clearly and repeatedly expressed its desire to see the full authority of the Lebanese government extended throughout Lebanon's territory. And it has emphasized its strong support for the aspirations of the Lebanese people to live in peace, free from foreign meddling. Every member of this council has a responsibility to help Lebanon's people avoid further tragedy, to support diplomatic efforts that would help restore calm along the Blue Line, which again would enable civilians in southern Lebanon and northern Israel to return to their homes, and to also press Iran to cease its destabilizing and dangerous use of Hezbollah to undermine regional security in a way that puts the Lebanese people in danger. This is the path toward greater regional stability, and the United States will continue to do everything possible to support de-escalation and an enduring diplomatic solution. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Algeria for requesting this meeting and welcome the presence of Lebanese Foreign Minister Mr. Abdallah Bou Habib. I listened carefully to the briefings by USG DiCarlo and High Commissioner Volker Turk. Thousands of communications devices in Lebanon, including pagers and two-way radios, were detonated remotely and simultaneously. The explosions caused thousands of civilian casualties.
深表关
China
切。
hereby registers profound shock
在
and
街头
grave
玩耍的孩
concern
子
over
失去
this
眼睛，
development. Children playing in the
在
street
超市
lost
购
their
物的母
eyes.
亲手脚
Mothers
致残，
shopping in supermarkets had
在
their
上班
limbs
途中的医
maimed.
生身负重
Doctors on
伤。
their way to work were critically
这种
injured.
惨状让
These
人
and other
不忍想象。
harrowing scenes are distressing beyond
通过
imagination.
远程操控通讯
Remotely
工具
detonating
发
communications
动
devices
无差别
in
袭击，
indiscriminate
造
attacks,
成大规
causing
模
mass
平民伤亡，
civilian
制
casualties
造社会恐
and
慌。
panic in society
这样的事情在
is
历史上闻所未闻。
unheard of in history.
这种行为
This
无疑
act
是
is,
对一国
without a
主
doubt,
权和安
a
全的
gross
严重侵犯，
violation of a country's
是
sovereignty
对
and
国际法，
security,
特别是
and
国
a
际人道法
blatant
的公
breach
然违
of
反，
international law,
是
particularly
对生命的
international
漠视和践踏。
humanitarian law, is an act that tramples on
袭击
human
手
lives
段之
with
残忍，
unconscionable
性质
callousness.
之恶劣，
The attacks were so
令人发指，
outrageously brutal and atrocious that
必须予以
they
最
deserve
强烈的谴责。
nothing less than condemnation in the
截止
strongest
目前，
terms.
尚
So
无
far,
人宣布
no
对
one
此
has
次袭击
claimed
负责，
responsibility for the said
但各方
attacks,
对
but
肇事
different
者已
parties
做出了基
have
本一
come
致
to
的判断。
more or less the same conclusion as to
我们
who did
呼吁
it.
对事件
We
进
call
行
for
全
a
面及
prompt,
时的调
full
查，
investigation to
追究
hold
策
the
划者和实施
orchestrators
者的责任
and。implementers to account.
当前，
Right now,
中东地
the
区局势
situation
岌岌
in the
可
Middle
危。
East is
以
hanging
色列
by a
在
thread.
加沙的军事行动
Israel's
仍在持
military
续，
operations
已
in
夺取
Gaza are
4
still
万多
ongoing,
巴勒斯
which
坦
have
民众
already
的生
claimed
命。
more than 40,000
以色列
Palestinian lives.
同时还在不
Meanwhile,
断加剧
Israel
邻以边
is
境地
also
区的紧张局
heightening
势。
the tensions around its border with
我们
Lebanon.
注意到有关分析
We
指
are
出，
informed by some analysis
此
that
次远
the
程操控袭
recent
击
remotely
预示着
executed
大
attacks
规模军
are
事
a
行动的开
precursor
始。
to major military operations.
我们也注
We
意到
have
真
also
主党
taken
领导
note
人
of the
的最
latest
新表态。
statement from the Hezbollah leadership.
我们对离异局势可
We
能
are
进一
deeply
步升
concerned
级
by
深
the
表担忧，
possibility of a further escalation of the
呼吁所
tensions
有各方
between
保
Lebanon and
持最
Israel.
大
We call on
限
the
度的
parties
克制，
to exercise
特
maximum
别呼吁
restraint
以色列
and call on Israel in
放下
particular
使用
to
武力的执
forego
念，
its obsession
立
with the
即
use of
停止
force
在
and to
加沙的
halt
军事行动，
without delay its military operations in
立
Gaza,
即停止
its
侵犯黎巴
violations
嫩
of
主权
Lebanon's
和安
sovereignty
全
and
的行
security,
为，立即停
and
止
its
可能将地区
adventurism
拖入新的
that
浩劫
risks
的冒险行径。
dragging the region into yet another devastating catastrophe.
我们强烈敦促
We strongly
对以
urge
色列有
countries
影响的
with
国家
influence
拿
over
出实际
Israel
行动，
to take
制
tangible
止以
steps
色列
to
在
stop
错误的道路
Israel
上
from
越
going
走越远。
further down the wrong
我们
path.
支持安理
We
会
support the Security
采取
Council
一切
in
必要行
taking
动，
all necessary
为
actions
缓和离异
and
局
doing
势、
all it
维
can
护中东
to
地区
ease the
和平稳
situation
定
between Lebanon
做
and
出最大
Israel
努
and
力。
to maintain
谢
peace
谢
and
主席。
stability in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank UNSC DiCarlo and High Commissioner Turk for their briefing today. This past year has seen continuous and devastating violence across the region. Civilians have suffered on a dreadful scale on both sides of the Blue Line. The explosions in Lebanon this week and Israel's strike in southern Beirut today are the latest in a deadly cycle of violence, and we are deeply concerned by civilian casualties resulting from those incidents. That children were among them is particularly distressing. Our condolences go to the families of the civilians killed. My Foreign Secretary made our view clear last night. We need an immediate ceasefire on both sides. We are working in lockstep with our allies to de-escalate tensions and end this destructive cycle. We want to see the implementation of a political plan based on UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which allows both Israeli and Lebanese civilians to return to their homes and live in peace and security. We are ready to play our role in a diplomatic process to achieve that. President, let us be clear. Hezbollah launched an unprovoked attack on Israel on 8 October 2023. Since then, Israel has faced a near daily barrage of Hezbollah rockets. We are resolute in our support for Israel's right to defend its citizens against such threats. However, in doing so, international humanitarian law must be fully respected, and all possible steps taken to avoid civilian casualties. Lebanese Hezbollah's aggression has been fueled by Iran and its continued destabilization of the Middle East, including through its support to partners and proxies. Iran supplies advanced weaponry in contravention of multiple Security Council resolutions, only prolonging the suffering of the Lebanese people. While Hezbollah and Iran continue to undermine Lebanon's future, the UK is providing practical support to bolster its stability and security. This includes funding and training to both the Lebanese armed forces and internal security forces, as well as humanitarian assistance to vulnerable communities, including in the south of Lebanon. President, now is the time for calm heads and an urgent focus on an immediate ceasefire to create the space for negotiations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
je remercie Madame DiCarlo et
Madame
Monsieur
DiCarlo
Turk pour
and
leurs
Mr. Turk
interventions
for
et
their
je tiens
briefings,
à saluer
and I
la
wish
présence
to
parmi
welcome
nous
the
du
presence
ministre
among
des Affaires
us of
étrangères
the
du
Minister
Liban.
for Foreign Affairs of Lebanon.
La France exprime
France
son inquiétude
is
à la suite des
gravely
explosions
concerned
d'appareils de
following the
télécommunications le
explosions
17
of
et 18
telecommunications
septembre
devices
au
on the
Liban.
17th and the
En effet,
18th of September in
le risque
Lebanon.
d'une guerre
The
ouverte
risk of
et aux
open
conséquences
war
potentiellement
with
dramatiques
potentially tragic
s'accroît
consequences
chaque jour.
heightens with each passing day. This is a prospect that needs to be averted at all costs. There's an urgent need for all parties to work towards de-escalation. Resolution 2749, adopted on the 28th of August to renew UNIFIL's mandate, clearly calls for this. This resolution calls upon all stakeholders to adopt immediate measures to de-escalate and demands the full implementation of the framework recognized by all, namely Resolution 1701, including the restoration of a complete cessation of hostilities. These resolutions must be complied with by all. To that end, we call upon, we demand that the Israeli authorities exercise utmost restraint after their recent declarations about military operations in Lebanon. We also recall our demand for Hezbollah to immediately cease its attacks against Israeli territory. And there's lastly a vital need for all parties to meet the obligations incumbent upon them under international humanitarian law, specifically vis-à-vis the protection of civilians. France has persisted in our efforts to identify the conditions for an agreement and to restore cessation of hostilities along the blue line, in line with Resolution 1701, and to ensure the safety and security of civilians both in Israel and in Lebanon. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank the Slovenia presidency for convening this urgent meeting requested by Algeria. We are grateful to Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and the High Commissioner Walkie-talkie for their insights on this deeply concerning matter. We also acknowledge the presence of His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lebanon, and representatives of Iran and Israel. Mr. President, Mozambique views the current situation in Lebanon with deep concern. The escalating cross-border hostilities between Hezbollah and Israel have significantly heightened regional tensions. We are particularly alarmed by the recent cyber attack in Beirut and other parts of the country, which resulted in the detonation of pagers and other electronic devices. This unprecedented incident, occurring on September 17 and 18, has led to a tragic loss of lives and numerous injuries. We deeply deplore the deaths of civilians. The targeting of populated areas, including homes, vehicles, commercial establishments, and public spaces, is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. Mozambique strongly condemns these attacks, which have resulted in at least 12 civilian fatalities and left thousands wounded. We note with grave concern that many of the casualties were not combatants but civilians, members of the Lebanon's Shia community engaged in non-military activities. The weaponization of civilian subjects is strictly prohibited under international law. The incident highlights the evolving nature of modern warfare, where cyber capabilities can be employed to inflict physical harm. The sophistication and audacity of this operation mark a dangerous escalation in the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. We are deeply troubled by the potential ramifications of this attack, which may herald a new phase of conflict in Lebanon and the broader Middle East region. The unprecedented nature of this incident raises serious concerns about the future stability of the area. We strongly condemn these attacks as they bring a notable escalation in the region after months of mostly low intensity conflict between the two contenders. Mozambique calls upon all parties to immediately cease all military and subversive activities. We also strongly emphasize the critical need for de-escalation to prevent further instability and the retaliatory actions. We urge all parties involved to strictly adhere to international law and Security Council resolutions. It is imperative to ensure the protection of civilians and the maintenance of peace and security in the region. In conclusion, Mr. President, Mozambique reiterates its commitment to the principles of the United Nations Charter and stands ready to support all efforts towards peaceful resolution of conflicts and the protection of civilian lives. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank Algeria for requesting this urgent meeting. I also thank USG DiCarlo and High Commissioner Turk for the updates provided, and welcome the participation of His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Bou Habib, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Emigrants of Lebanon, in today's meeting. I also acknowledge the participation of the permanent representatives of Israel, Iran, and Syria in our meeting. Mr. President, Guyana is alarmed by the reports of well-coordinated, widespread lethal attacks earlier this week across Lebanon and Syria, where pagers and other communication devices were transformed into deadly weapons. These attacks were apparently aimed at specific targets, but ultimately were indiscriminate in their effect, as many of the detonations occurred in crowded areas. The result, according to the Minister of Health of Lebanon, is that 37 persons have died, including 2 children, and more than 3,000 injured. We are also deeply concerned about the strike carried out this morning by Israel in a densely populated area in Beirut, which also resulted in the deaths of at least 14 persons and injury to more than 50. Any attack causing harm to civilians must be thoroughly investigated to establish the circumstances, attribute responsibility for the harm caused, and hold to account the perpetrators. The ongoing and intensifying attacks on Lebanon's sovereignty and territorial integrity will only serve to escalate the already tense situation in Lebanon and further heighten the risk of widening the violence in the Middle East region. Mr. President, the situation in the Middle East has become untenable. Too many parties are poised for war. We have heard on many occasions of the diplomatic efforts underway and the need for the Council to support these efforts. We commend those efforts and believe they are operating in good faith. However, given the time that has elapsed since Resolution 2735, without a deal for a ceasefire in Gaza, and the increasing horrific events that continue to occur, we do not believe that all parties in this conflict are operating in good faith. The plain and simple truth is that there is a common thread running across the region in the chaos and destruction that has upended the lives of civilians. There is one party that has chosen over and over again to take escalatory action at every opportunity, to abandon diplomatic negotiations while breaching the rule of international law and humanitarian law. Mr. President, Guyana again calls on countries of the region to fully comply with their international obligations and to uphold the principle of respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. We demand that all parties adhere to international law, including international humanitarian law and the United Nations Charter. It is imperative that there be a return to maximum restraint and an abandonment of rhetoric that only serves to inflame. We call on those with considerable influence to do more. They can and must exert maximum pressure to direct us away from this path that can lead to unimaginable agony in Lebanon and the wider region. A ceasefire in Gaza to end the immense suffering in the Strip is at the heart of de-escalating the increasing tensions in the region. Mr. President, the reality that we must confront is that lasting peace will not come through war. Violence will only doom us all to a cycle of escalating attacks, death, and destruction. The people of the Middle East are no less deserving of stability and security. Leaders of the region must recommit to dialogue and to a peaceful resolution to this conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG DiCarlo and High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Volker Turk, for their briefings. Japan is extremely concerned with the situation in the Middle East and is monitoring the escalation of tensions with grave concern, especially the incidents this week where a large number of communication devices exploded across Lebanon and Syria, reportedly killing dozens of people and injuring thousands. We are concerned that children were among the victims, including those reportedly killed. Mr. President, Japan urges all concerned actors to refrain from any further action or retaliation to avoid a further catastrophe in the region. The ongoing Gaza conflict has already inflamed regional tensions. No one desires another full-scale conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, and civilians always pay the highest price if such a situation arises. All parties must once again recall their commitment to the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701 and return to a cessation of hostilities. The fact that these incidents happened in multiple places, including densely populated areas, and caused civilian casualties is appalling. Civilians must be protected at all times in accordance with international law. We call for an urgent, thorough, and transparent investigations into the blasts. The exchange of fire across the Blue Line has expanded dramatically since October last year. In relation to this, Japan reiterates its strong support for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the release of the hostages based on the outlines of Security Council Resolution 2735. We stress the need for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in the Middle East. We remain committed to making every diplomatic effort to end the violence and restore stability in the region. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And I thank Mr. Carlo and Mr. Tuck for their briefings and welcome the presence of His Excellency the Foreign Minister of Lebanon and acknowledge the participation of the permanent representatives of Syria, Iran and Israel. The Council meets today against the backdrop of what it has warned about for months, the growing prospect of regional escalation. Earlier this week, widespread simultaneous explosions across Lebanon killed at least 40 people and injured thousands of others, including children. The images we have witnessed are distressing. We echo the sentiments outlined by UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Turk. The simultaneous targeting of thousands of individuals, whether civilians or members of armed groups, without knowledge as to who was in possession of the targeted devices, their location and their surroundings, violates international human rights law and, to the extent applicable, international humanitarian law. The large-scale consequences of such a widespread attack, including the large number of civilian casualties, were foreseeable. Such action also reflects a worrying disregard for established norms and IHL. Now, there must be an independent and transparent investigation as to how these consumer electronic devices were turned into bombs, which were detonated in populated areas, impacting civilians and overwhelming Lebanon's health services. President, recent Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon serve as another escalation that exacerbates tensions, which we denounce. This takes place whilst the military wing of Hezbollah persists with its indiscriminate firing of rockets into Israel. We also continue to condemn these actions. The lasting psychological impact of this violence on the local population on both sides of the Blue Line must not be underestimated. The people of the region cannot afford another war. We must do everything in our power to prevent further conflict. The protection of civilians is paramount. The devastating impact of the war in Gaza on the situation across the Blue Line and the risk of it spiraling into a wider conflict is greater than ever before. What should come next is clear. This Council must focus on prioritizing de-escalation and restraint across the region. This behavior must also be implemented by the relevant actors whose aggressive rhetoric and apparent inclination to further escalation only begets further hostilities. This Council must act in a decisive manner to ensure the full implementation of Security Council Resolutions 2712, 2720 and 2735. A ceasefire agreement must be reached without further delay. We call on all member states in the region and those with influence over the parties to redouble their efforts to this end. The fate of the region depends on it. For Lebanon, a political and diplomatic solution remains essential to de-escalate the situation and ensure long-term stability. The parties must immediately return to a cessation of hostilities and to recommit to the full implementation of Resolution 1701. A dramatic escalation in Lebanon only moves us further from this goal. In conclusion, President, the region is on the precipice of an all-out war. Cool heads must prevail. Peace must prevail. The only way this can be achieved is for all parties to exercise restraint, to de-escalate, and pursue peaceful solutions to all disputes. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to begin by thanking Algeria for convening this meeting. I also wish to recognize the presence of the Foreign Affairs Minister of Lebanon and also the delegations of Israel, Iran and Syria in this chamber. The extremely violent events which have been seen in Lebanon in recent days are cause for alarm and grave concern. Ecuador is grateful for and takes note of the information provided by Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and by the High Commissioner Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Volker Turk. The explosion of communication devices in Lebanon has caused tens of deaths and wounded hundreds and has plunged the civilian population into fear. International humanitarian law must be respected by all parties. The protection of civilians is a responsibility of the entire international community and one which cannot be shirked. With this in mind, we condemn bombardments, the launching of missiles and armed drones, as well as the indiscriminate use of explosives planted in communication devices in populated areas. These acts are a flagrant violation of international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. These acts must be the subject of an independent investigation to determine who was responsible. It is pertinent here to recall Resolution 1701, considered under another agenda item, because it demands a definitive cessation of hostilities in the Blue Line sector. Ecuador echoes the appeal of the Secretary-General for all parties to exercise utmost restraint in order to avoid an escalation of tensions in the region. The spiral of violence unleashed could have unpredictable consequences, whose ramifications would, as always, primarily be felt by the civilian population. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we support Algiers' initiative to convene today's meeting in connection with the latest dangerous wave of escalation in the Middle East region. We closely studied the concerns of both Lebanon and Iran, which were set out in correspondence that had been circulated yesterday. We listened to the reports and the briefings of the Deputy Undersecretary General and Mr. Turk about the situation in Lebanon with concern. We welcome the participation in today's meeting of the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Lebanon. Mr. President, unfortunately, the devastating bombardment, airstrikes, and brutal ground cleansings have for nearly a year become a grim daily reality for the Middle East. Despite the protests of the international community, the abhorrent practice of targeted liquidations is expanding. It would seem that in this cauldron of violence, there is no longer any act which we all would not condemn. We do not condemn time and time again in this chamber. However, what transpired in Lebanon and Syria over the past week brings the escalation in Lebanon and Syria into a new high-technology dimension, and this is a very dangerous turn. As a result of the appalling provocations with the spate of detonations of two-way handheld communications devices in recent days, 37 people died, including 2 children. More than 4,000 were wounded. Those who carried out this barbaric crime spared nobody. The detonations occurred in hospitals, in markets, on the streets, in stores and in pharmacies. It is clear that this is a coordinated, remotely guided operation for which no one has assumed responsibility. However, in the region, facts have been analyzed, dots have been connected, and the relevant conclusions have been drawn. We regard what happened as a terrorist act which poses a threat to international peace and security with unpredictable consequences for the entire Middle East. We emphatically condemn this unprecedented attack on the friendly Lebanon and its citizens, which is an egregious violation of its sovereignty and a major challenge to international law. We extend sincere condolences to the families of the dead, and we wish a speedy recovery to those who were wounded. Those behind this crime certainly are aware that such attempts to draw Lebanon into a regional confrontation are fueling an already volatile situation in the region. Clearly, the organizers of this unprecedented attack, unprecedented in terms of the malicious use of domestic communications devices, have deliberately been seeking to foment a large-scale military confrontation. They have striven to provoke a new major Middle East war. This is not the first such attempt. This is a continuation of a spate of political attacks and murders and assassinations in Lebanon, Syria, in Lebanon, and Iran, for a part of which the West Jerusalem authorities have assumed responsibility. These include the largest in the past year
bombardment by Israel of South Lebanon, which continued for 2 consecutive hours and was followed by another strike on South Beirut, as a result of which, according to the Lebanese Ministry of Health, 8 people died and another 59 were wounded. The entire world was flooded with images showing the horrific magnitude of the devastation from the Israeli airstrike. We strongly condemn such actions by West Jerusalem. We call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, to immediately cease fire, and to comply with the provisions of Resolution 1701. A major war in the Middle East is in nobody's interest. Also noteworthy is that spiraling violence is clearly undermining the Biden administration's widely touted efforts, both for ceasefire in the Gaza Strip and for stabilization of the situation on the Blue Line in Lebanon. The results of this pseudo-diplomacy are dubious at best. Instead of peace, there's we see ongoing bloodletting in the occupied Palestinian territory, the murder of the head of the political bureau of Hamas, Mr. Hanin, who was the main negotiator on the deal with Israel, and now the first ever large-scale terrorist attack with the use of information communications technologies, which resulted in fatalities. In the light of the policy declared by Washington and allies to use ICT for the attainment of offensive military political objectives, it is clear that specifically their actions have brought us to this threshold where we are liable to encounter terrorist threat with the use of domestic appliances. Given that according to incoming reports, we're talking about remote manipulation of electronic devices. By the way, from a different jurisdiction, we view this as an exceedingly dangerous precedent. We repeatedly cautioned against such risks, including at specialized United Nations platforms, where the issue of international information security is discussed. Having foreseen that ICT can be used for destructive purposes, Russia has already for a number of years advanced the idea of establishment of a specific international legal regime to govern the digital landscape, and this would take into account technical vulnerabilities, including anonymity, cross-border features, and other hidden functions. Unfortunately, the United States and allies consistently object to any such obligations in this sphere in order to maintain their freedom of movement. The consequences of this are apparent in the terrorist attack in Lebanon. If we were talking about the consequences for the information telecommunications landscape, these kinds of incidents further worsen the already growing mistrust by states of information communications devices manufactured in other countries. This, in turn, furthers the trend of self-isolation of national infrastructures in this area, and as a consequence results in the fragmentation of the information space, undermining international standards in this area, the destruction of supply chains, and the expansion of the digital divide between developed and developing countries. With respect to the terrorist attack in Lebanon, the question of the origin of the electronic devices used for the explosions is fundamental. There is a need for a detailed account of the commercial structures involved regarding the safety of their products. Let us recall that states, pursuant to specialized key resolutions of the General Assembly, states have the obligation to ensure supply chain integrity. Mr. President, regardless of however horrific this instance of the use of ICT for terrorist purposes may be, the international community is not powerless in the face of this threat. Recently, at Russia's initiative, a global intergovernmental directory of points of contact was launched to prevent and resolve serious incidents in the information landscape, as well as to reduce tensions in crisis situations. This instrument was specifically designed in order to prevent escalation in the digital landscape, which is liable to then spill spill over into the real world. We call upon all stakeholders, first and foremost Lebanon, to avail itself of this directory. We expect that the recipients of a possible request from Beirut will immediately study it and will provide a response to Lebanese colleagues. This is key to determine all of the circumstances behind what happened in Lebanon. Mr. President, it is clear to all that the key to resolving the current and to the key to reversing the current unprecedented escalation in the Middle East lies in ending the bloodletting in the Gaza Strip, where the number of dead has now exceeded 42,000 people. The only resolution is a prompt establishment of a ceasefire, exchange of hostages and prisoners, and the organization of unimpeded humanitarian access to the Strip. This is the only way to relaunch the process of peaceful resolution to the Palestinian question on the international legal basis, at the heart of which lies the principle of 2 states for 2 peoples, which we steadfastly support. For our part, we stand ready to cooperate with all who share these objectives. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, I also thank Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and High Commissioner Mr. Volker Turk for their important briefing. We acknowledge the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigrant of Lebanon and the representative of Iran, Syria, and Israel in this meeting. Sierra Leone is deeply concerned over the significant deterioration of the security situation in Lebanon and North Israel. Instability and violence have increased across Lebanon over these past 3 days, after a series of explosions of communication devices meant to be in the possession of members of Hezbollah. It has been reported that at least 37 people have been killed, with at least 2,931 people suffering injuries, and some of whom are in intensive care. Similar communication devices attack occurred in Syria, resulting in deaths and injuries. These attacks have been followed by intense strikes in southern Lebanon by Israeli warplanes, reportedly the heaviest aerial strikes since October 2023. We further note reports of Hezbollah's retaliatory missile and drone strikes in northern Israel on Thursday, killing 2 soldiers and injuring 9. We note with concern that these actions have definitely led to a further escalation in the cycle of violent attacks between the 2 parties and an exacerbation of tensions in an already volatile region with dire security and humanitarian consequences for civilians. There are reports that the communication devices explosion in Lebanon occurred in populated areas, including at a funeral, and that there are civilians, including children, among the dead and injured. Sierra Leone condemns the killing of civilians in these attacks, which, when carried out without taking into consideration the principle of distinction, is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. As we join the UN Secretary General urging the parties to exercise restraint, we remind the conflicting parties and those that enable them with complicity to comply with their obligations under international law to protect civilian and civilian infrastructure. Without accountability, the ongoing blatant violations of international law can only embolden the perpetrators and endanger the seeming specter of impunity that seems to characterize the Middle East conflicts. Mr. President, just yesterday, a member of the elders, former Prime Minister Ellen Clark, asked whether the Security Council is interested in implementing its own resolutions. Several reports for UNIFIL this year has informed the Council that Hezbollah and the Israel Defense Forces have been engaged in tit-for-tat exchanges of fire beyond the blue line since the 7th October attack, with the attacks initially unprovoked from Hezbollah. The breach of the 1701 resolution and the escalation of attacks on the back of inflammatory rhetoric and the movement of troops are deeply alarming as they continue to foment tensions which risk bringing the parties very close to all-out war. Separate from the war in Gaza, the security and safety of Israeli civilians in northern Israel must be of concern. Security Council Resolution 1701 must be respected by all, and the Council must be in a position to implement all of its resolutions. As the region grapples with the war in Gaza and the dire humanitarian crisis, we reject actions that may jeopardize the ongoing peace negotiations between Israel and Hamas and threats in regional and global peace and security. We call on countries in the region and elsewhere with influence to prevail upon both parties to desist from further attacks over the Blue Line and elsewhere. The impact of a full-blown conflict on the Lebanese people and economy would be completely devastating. The people of Lebanon have already gone through a lengthy and destructive war and periods of fragility, and this Council should do all it can to prevent a recurrence. As Lebanon seeks to stabilize its economy, we note efforts taken to pass a budget earlier this year, and we urge lawmakers to undertake governance and macroeconomic reforms needed to improve state authority and resource mobilization. We therefore call on the parties to use diplomatic channels, including United Nations good offices, to avoid further escalation and the risk of all-out war or wider devastating regional conflagration. In this regard, Sierra Leone commends UNIFIL for their relentless effort in maintaining channels of communications, as well as the physical intervention of peacekeepers. Events since October 7, 2023 have only underscored the importance of the mission's liaison and coordination mechanisms. We remain concerned over the impact of missile strikes on UNIFIL positions and injury to peacekeepers. We condemn all acts that endanger the lives of peacekeepers. We urge all parties to ensure the safety and security of UN personnel and respect the inviolability of UN premises. In conclusion, Sierra Leone continues to call for de-escalation and the need for the parties to consider the regional implications of their actions and to recommit to a cessation of hostilities. This includes a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and a holistic approach to the release of hostages and prisoners, and the implementation of a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Slovenia. First, I want to thank Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and High Commissioner Turk for their briefings. I welcome Minister Habib in the chamber, and I also welcome the representatives of Iran, Israel, and Syrian Arab Republic in the room. I would like to express our profound concern over the latest developments in the Middle East. Let me make 3 points in this regard. First, we condemn the recent series of explosions across Lebanon and also in Syria. This unprecedented attack caused civilian deaths and injuries, instilling fear and further destabilizing the region. These explosions were devastatingly coordinated, leaving hundreds of people, among them children, injured or dead. It has created a climate of terror. We are stepping in a dangerous new territory, and as new technology is being used and developed, we underline the need to respect existing legal obligations. Civilian objects should not be weaponized. The international law is clear. Use of booby traps is prohibited. As underlined by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, simultaneous targeting of thousands of individuals, whether civilians or members of armed groups, without knowledge as to who was in possession of the targeted devices, their location, and their surroundings at the time of the attack, violates international human rights law and, to the extent applicable, international humanitarian law. We call on all parties to respect international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. We support an independent and transparent investigation. Secondly, tensions between Lebanon and Israel, especially along the Blue Line, are alarming. This includes heavy exchanges in recent days, as well as today's strike in Beirut and the subsequent retaliation. We deplore the loss of civilian lives. We once again call for restoration of cessation of hostilities and full implementation of the Resolution 1701. We are appalled by the heavy impact on civilian infrastructure and civilians, many of whom have been displaced. It was violence that drove them from their homes in the first place. Additional violence will not bring them back. If anything, it will make their safe return an even harder task. Thirdly, we are in this situation because our resolutions have not been complied with. We call on conclusion of agreement on ceasefire and the release of hostages. We continue to call for maximum restraint by all actors in the region. The cycle of violence is increasing speed, and it risks escalating into a wider conflict. We call on all parties, both state and non-state actors, to de-escalate and refrain from any further retaliatory actions. We repeat our call on states with influence on those actors to use this influence to encourage utmost restraint and to prevent any further deterioration of the situation on the ground. This includes the troubling escalatory rhetoric of different countries and actors. Colleagues, Security Council must be united in upholding international law and maintaining peace and security. The situation between Lebanon and Israel and the war in Gaza threaten to spark a wider conflict, especially with Israel's stated intention to expand military action beyond its northern border. We have to be clear. Such action would be an attack on a sovereign state. We must prevent this by promoting diplomatic solutions that offer long-term stability. The region cannot endure another war, and we must act before the situation spirals beyond control. For almost a year, we have been cautioning from provocations and escalations, further aggravating the situation in the Middle East. We have said it before. Any of these escalations can become a conflict with a life of its own or engulf the whole region in a complex war. It is for this reason we believe diplomacy must be the only path forward. And Slovenia therefore particularly welcomes the Lebanese Foreign Minister's participation at this meeting today. Thank you. I resume my functions as President of the Council. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Abdallah Bouhabib, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigrants of Lebanon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, President.
First, I want to thank the Undersecretary DiCarlo and the High Commissioner Turk for their presentations, as well as thank all members of the Council for acknowledging the severity and devastating consequences of the electronic attacks on peace and security of the fate of the humanity. سيد الرئيس، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، لم يعد أحد في هذا العالم بأمان بعد الهجمات الإلكترونية التي حصلت مؤخرا في لبنان وفاقت الخيال والتصور، وما نتج عنها من ضحايا مدنيين أبرياء بالآلاف من الجرحى، ومنهم أيضا ضحايا من الأطفال والنساء والشيوخ. إن مسؤولية مجلس الأمن ليست فقط تجاه الأبرياء اللبنانيين الذين سقطوا ظلما، بل تجاه الإنسانية جمعاء. فإذا مر هذا العمل الإرهابي في مجلسكم مرور الكرام بلا محاسبة وتم تجهيل الفاعل وعدم ردعه وإدانته وإرغامه على وقف هذه الاعتداءات، فإن مصداقية هذا المجلس والقانون الدولي وشرع حقوق الإنسان في خطر محدد. إن تقبلكم لما حدث يعني موافقتكم على فتح صندوق العجائب، حيث ستحظو دول ومجموعات متطرفة حظو إسرائيل وتستهدف المدنيين من كل حدب وصوب بهذه التكنولوجيا الفتاكة، ولن يتمكن أحد من منع استخدامها مستقبلا لاستهداف طائرات مدنية وقطارات وخلافه لقتل المدنيين وترويعهم بصورة عشوائية دون تمييز. أليس هذا الإرهاب بعينه عندما يتم استهداف شعب بكامله في مدنه وشوارعه وأسواقه ومحلاته وبيوته وهم يقضون احتياجاتهم؟
to their daily
ولا
life
يقاتلون على الجبهات.
while they are not fighting on the
يكفي
front.
لفهم ما حصل أن نتأمل
To understand
بهوية
what
الضحايا.
happened, it is enough to look into the
فالأصبح
identity
المطلوب
of the
اليوم
victims.
إبادة وإعاقة
Are
الشعب
we seeking
اللبناني
today
كعقاب
the
جماعي؟
annihilation of the Lebanese
من
people
حقنا
and
أن
its
نسأل
collective punishment?
أليس هذا
It is
السيناريو
our right
الذي
to ask,
صرح
isn't
به
this the
كبار
scenario
المسؤولين
that was
الإسرائيليين؟
stated by
انظروا إلى
senior
بشاعة ما
Israeli
حصل في هذه
officials?
الصور.
Look at the ugliness of what has happened in these pictures.
سأعتذر عن ما
I apologize for this picture.
والإضاءة على ما حصل ونتائجه.
To highlight what
في
has
يوم
happened
الثلاثاء
and its
موافق
consequences on
17
Tuesday,
9
the 17th
2024
of September
نفذت إسرائيل
2024,
هجوما
Israel
إلكترونيا
carried
واسع
out
النطاق
a wide-scale
استهدف
electronic
الآلاف
attack
الأجهزة
targeting
المحمولة
thousands of pagers,
المعروفة ببيجرز مما أدى إلى تفجيرها.
detonating
في
them.
اليوم التالي
On the following day,
قامت مرة أخرى بتفجير
Israel once
مئات
again
الأجهزة
detonated
اللاسلكية
hundreds
من
of
نوع آخر.
walkie-talkies.
إضافة إلى قيامها بتاريخ 19/9
On the 19th of September,
بترويع
Israel
سكان
also
العاصمة
terrorized
بيروت وكافة
the
المناطق
population
بتحليق
of Beirut
الطيران
and other
الحربي على
regions
علو
when
منخفض
warfare
وخرقه المتكرر لجدار
broke the
الصوت
sound barrier
مما
repeatedly,
أدى إلى حالات هلع
unleashing
لا
fear
سيما
and
لدى
panic,
الأطفال.
especially among
وبتاريخ
children.
اليوم
Today,
نفذت إسرائيل
Israel
اعتداء
carried out
صاروخيا
a
في
missile
عمق
attack
أكثر المناطق اختصاصا
in one of the
بالسكان
most densely
من الضاحية
populated
الجنوبية
regions in the
للعاصمة
southern
بيروت
suburb of Beirut,
فدمرت مبنى
destroying a
سكنيا
residential complex
وأوقعت في
and
حصيلة
claiming the lives
حصيلة أولوية
of
14
12
ضحية
victims,
منهم أطفال
including children,
و66
and
جريحة.
66 wounded.
هذه الهجمات أدت حتى
These
الآن إلى
attacks have
وفاة
led so
عشرات
far
الأشخاص
to the killings of dozens of
بينهم
people,
أطفال
including children and
ونساء
women,
وإصابة آلاف
to the
الجرحى
injuring of
ومنهم
thousands,
مئات في حالة خطرة
including hundreds
بالإضافة إلى
in a
مئات
serious
آخرين
condition.
تعرضوا لتشوهات
Hundreds others
جسدية
were
أو
disfigured,
فقدوا أحد
were
أطرافهم
maimed,
أو بصرهم
or even
بالكامل.
lost sight
وقد
completely.
ترك هذا الهجوم
This
المستشفيات
attack
والطواقم
left
الطبية
hospitals
في
and medical
لبنان في
workers
حالة طوارئ غير
in an
مسبوقة
unprecedented emergency
مستفزا
state,
قدرتها
fully
الاستيعابية
overwhelmed.
مستنفذا قدرتها الاستيعابية كما أثارها الاعتداء
The aggression
حالة
also
واسعة من الرعب
created
والهلع
a state of
بين
terror and
المدنيين
panic
في
among
كافة
civilians
المناطق
in all
اللبنانية.
Lebanese regions.
تأتي هذه الهجمات التي
These
تمثل
attacks
سابقة خطر
represent
وغير مسبوقة
a
في
serious,
تاريخ الحروب
unprecedented event
في
in the
أعقاب
history of
سلسلة
wars,
من
and they come in
التصريحات
the
الإسرائيلية
aftermath of
بشأن حرب
Israeli
واسعة على
declarations
لبنان
concerning a full-scale war
وإعادته
on
إلى العصر
Lebanon,
الحجري.
sending Lebanon back
لم
to the Stone
تكتفي
Age.
إسرائيل بهذه الهجمات
Israel did
فحسب
not only
بل
launch these
تبعتها
attacks,
بإصدار تصريحات
they were
رسمية
followed by official
وتغريدة
declarations
لمستشار
and
رئيس
by a tweet
حكومتها
from the
تم
advisor of their
حذفها
prime minister that
لاحقا
was
بسرعة
lately deleted,
تؤكد ضلوعها وتحقيقها نتائج إيجابية من هذا العدوان
emphasizing the
مما
responsibility
نسف
of
بصورة
Israel and
متعمدة
praising the positive
مهمة
results
الوسطاء
of this assault.
الدوليين
This has
الذين يعملون على
deliberately
وقف لإطلاق
undermined the
النار
efforts
في
of
غزة وجنوب
international
لبنان
mediators working for a
وكافة
ceasefire
محاولات
in Gaza
الحكومة
and South
اللبنانية
Lebanon, and has undermined all the attempts
لخفض
of the Lebanese
التسعير
government
وضبط
to
النفس.
de-escalate and exercise
وفي هذا
self-restraint.
السياق نشدد على أن اللجوء إلى تفجير
In this
آلاف
context,
أجهزة اتصال
it should be
عن
noted
بعد
that
بشكل
resorted to
جماعي
remotely
وغادر
exploding
دون اعتبار لمن
communication
يحملها
devices
أو لمن
collectively
يتواجد
with
بالقرب
no
منها
regard to
يعد
those
أسلوبا
carrying them
قتاليا
or
غير مسبوق في وحشيته
who
وإرهابه
are around them
إن استهداف
is
آلاف
considered an
الأشخاص من
unprecedented
مختلف الفئات العمرية
method of
وفي
warfare in
مناطق
its
واسعة
brutality and
ومكتظة
terror,
بالسكان
targeting thousands of
تشمل
people
كافة
from different
المناطق
age groups
اللبنانية
in densely
أثناء
populated
ممارستهم
areas, while
لحياتهم
tending to
اليومية في
their daily
المنازل
life,
والشوارع
in their homes, on
وأماكن
streets,
العمل
in
ومراكز
workplaces,
التسوق
in shopping
هو
centers,
الإرهاب
is
بعينه
nothing but terrorism.
وانتهاك صارح
It is a
للقانون
blatant
الدولي
violation
الإنساني
of international
وشرعة حقوق
humanitarian law,
الإنسان
of
ويصنف من دون
international
أدنى
human
شك
rights law,
كجريمة حرب.
and amounts to war crime.
فالبروتوكول الأول
The first
الإضافي
additional
لاتفاقية
protocol
جنيف
to the
لعام
Geneva Convention of
1949
1949
والمتعلق بحماية
pertaining to the
ضحايا
protection of
النزاعات
victims of
المسلحة
armed conflicts
ينص في المادة
stipulates
35
in
على حق
Article 35 that the right of parties to the conflict to choose methods of warfare is not unlimited, which means that using electronic detonation
as a
وهو
warfare,
أسلوب غير تقليدي
which is a
يجب أن يخضع
non-conventional
للقانون
warfare,
الدولي
should be
والإنساني
subjected to
لا
international
سيما
and
مبدأ الحماية
humanitarian laws,
أي
especially the
تأمين
principle
الحماية
of
للسكان
protection,
المدنيين
meaning
حسب المادة
protecting
48
civilians according
مبدأ
to Article
الاحتياط
48
أي
and
أن
the
يتخذ
principle
كل
of
طرف في
precaution,
النزاع
whereas all
كافة
parties to the
الاحتياطات
conflict should
عند
take all the
إدارة العمليات
necessary precautions
العسكرية
when directing
لتجنب
their
أحداث
military
الخسائر
operations
في أرواح
to
المدنيين
avoid civilian loss
وإلحاق
of life
الخسائر
and to
بالممتلكات
avoid damaging
المدنية
civilian
المادة
property.
57
This is Article
كذلك
57.
ينص البروتوكول الأول
The first protocol
الإضافي في المادة
also
51
stipulates in
على
Article
حظر
51
أعمال العنف أو
the
التهديد بالعنف
prohibition
التي
of the acts of
تستهدف
or threats
نشر
of
الذعر
violence, the
بين
primary
المدنيين
purpose of which
كما
is to
حذر في
spread
المادة
terror among
37
civilian
قتل الخصم
population.
أو
It also
إصابته
prohibits
أو
in
أسره باللجوء إلى الغدر
killing,
كذلك
injuring, or
حذر في المادة
capturing an
85
adversary using
استهداف
perfidy.
مواقع خالية من
Article
وسائل
58
الدفاع
also prohibits using
وأيضا قامت
or
إسرائيل
targeting
من خلال
defenseless
هذا العدوان
areas.
الإرهابي
Israel,
بخرق
through this
المبادئ
terrorist aggression,
الأساسية
has
للقانون
violated
الدولي
the basic
الإنساني
principles of international
بجهة عدم
humanitarian law
التمييز بين المدنيين والعسكريين حيث
and did not
استهدفت
distinguish between
المدنيين
civilians
بصورة
and
عشوائية
military
كما أن
personnel. It
عملها
has
هذا
indiscriminately targeted civilians, and
ما
this
يبرره
operation was
إضافة
not
لأنه
justified by
لم يكن
necessity
متناسبا.
and was not proportional
السيد
either.
الرئيس
Mr. President,
لقد أصبح من الواضح أن إسرائيل لا
it is
تلتزم
clear
بالقانون
that
الدولي
Israel does not
والإنساني
abide
ولا
by
بالقرارات
international
الصادرة
and
عن
humanitarian
أجهزة
law,
الأمم
and that it does not
المتحدة
abide
ومنها
by
مجلس
UN
الأمن
resolutions and Security
وأنها
Council
لطالما
resolutions.
تجاهلت
It is clear
وتتجاهل
that
الشرعية
Israel
الدولية
continues to ignore the
وحقوق
international
الإنسان
legitimacy
لأنها
and human
اعتادت
rights
أن لا
because
تحاسبها
it is
الدول على
used to never
أفعالها
be held accountable.
حيث تصدر مواقف خجولة تجاه ارتكاباتها لا
When
تتعدى
Israel commits
الأسف
such acts,
مما يشجعها
we
على
only witness
الاستخفاف
timid
بقرارات
expressions
الشرعية
of
الدولية
regret,
التي لم
which emboldens
ينفذ أي
Israel
من
to
ينفذ
disregard the
أي منها
international
بحق
resolutions,
إسرائيل
none of which
منذ
has
العام
been implemented against Israel
1942
since
أي
1948.
قرار فأصبحت
As a
الأخيرة
result,
دولة
Israel has
مارقة
become a rogue
ومع
state.
ذلك لا يمكن قبول هذه الحقيقة
Despite
كأمر
all
واقع
that, we cannot accept
إذ لا
this
يمكن
reality
السماح
as a status quo.
لاستمرار
We
إسرائيل
cannot
في
accept
الإفلات من العقاب
to
والمحاسبة
allow Israel to continue
فلم
enjoying
تتعلم إسرائيل
impunity.
شيئا من اجتياحاتها
Israel did not
المتكررة
draw any
للبنان
lesson from
على مدى
its
عقود
repeated
من
invasions
الزمن
of Lebanon
حيث لم
throughout
تحصد
decades.
سوى الخيبات والهزائم وآخرها هروبها من لبنان
Israel
عام
was
2000
repeatedly disappointed
تاركة
and
وراءها
defeated. It fled
سلاحها
Lebanon in
وعتادها
the year 2000,
والمغامرة
leaving behind
الجديدة
its
التي
weapons
تبشرنا
and
بها إسرائيل
equipment.
لن
This
تكون
new
سوى
adventure
نسخة
that
قبيحة
Israel
عن
is
سابقتها
embarking on will only be
وتكرارا
another
لما
ugly
حققته
version of
الحرب
the previous
العقيمة
ones. It
على
will
غزة
repeat
وأطفالها
what the
أي
senseless war
البؤس
has achieved
والتطرف
against Gaza
والدمار
and its children.
قد
I
تؤدي
mean by
أيضا
that misery,
إلى حرب
extremism and
إقليمية
destruction. It
طاحنة
might also lead
تختلف عن
to
كل
an
سابقاتها
all-out
من
devastating
حيث
regional
رقعتها
war
الجغرافية على
that
امتداد
would
الشرق
engulf the
الأوسط
whole Middle East
وأنواع الأسلحة الفتاكة
with the
والدقيقة
use of
وحجم
lethal
الدمار
precise
وأعداد
weapons
الضحايا
and to large-scale
السيد
devastation
الرئيس
and large amount
لقد بحى صوت
large number of
اللبنانيين
victims.
حكومة
Mr.
وشعبا
President,
بأننا لسنا هواة حرب
the
ولا
Lebanese people and the
سعساء
Lebanese
بل
government are
نطالب
not war
بالعدالة
lovers, and
والحل
we do not
الدبلوماسي
seek revenge. We are only seeking
وعودة
justice,
النازحين
a
إلى القرى
diplomatic settlement, and the
فلتعلم
return of
إسرائيل
the displaced
مهما
to their
بلغت
villages.
قوتها العسكرية
Israel,
والتكنولوجية
no matter how
بأنها
mighty
لن
and strong
تعيد
it is, should
نازحيها إلى
understand
قراهم
that it
بقوة
cannot
السلاح
return its
بل
displaced to their villages with the force of
ستهجر
weapons.
من لم يتهجر
Israel
بعد
will be
إذا
displacing
وسعت
those who haven't been
اعتداءاتها
displaced yet if they
وبأن لا مكان
expand
لها في هذا
their
الشرق
attacks.
إلا
Israel
بالتصالح مع
cannot
شعوبه
remain in
وليس
the
فقط مع
East
حكامه من
unless it
خلال
makes peace
إعطاء
with the
الفلسطينيين
peoples of this
حقوقهم
region,
المشروعة
and this will happen by
ودولتهم
granting the
الموعودة
Palestinians their
من
legitimate
هذه
rights
المنظمة
and
بالذات
their state, which
منذ
was
أكثر من
promised to
75
them
عام
by this organization
فمهما طال
75 years
الزمن
ago.
وكثرت التضحيات
Rights shall be restored to the right holders, however long it takes. We came to this council today not only to defend Lebanon and the innocent Lebanese victims. We came to the council to protect our common humanity and to ask you to condemn the terrorist Israeli attacks clearly and unequivocally, to hold Israel accountable for planning and implementing these attacks and for violating
the sovereignty of Lebanon and its territorial integrity, for violating the UN Charter and Resolution 1701. Lebanon also calls upon you to compel Israel to stop its war machinery, to avert a destructive regional war, to preserve the credibility of the United Nations and its role in maintaining international peace and security. Lebanon still believes in the relevance of international peace and security and the relevance of this Council. We are not looking for a new resolution that would remain a dead letter, as is the case, unfortunately, with every resolution pertaining to Israel. Mr. President, to conclude, I would like to thank Algeria, the representative of the Arab group in the Security Council, which always stood by Lebanon and supported us in all circumstances. I call upon the members of the Security Council to stand on the right side of history, to defend justice and peace, and to support Lebanon in its effort to achieve stability and security. This is the moment of truth. And we are resorting to the justice of the United Nations and counting on your credibility. Either this Council compels Israel to stop its aggression and implement Security Council Resolutions 1701 and 2735 and end its war on all fronts, allow the return of the displaced to their villages, or we will be silent witnesses to the great explosion that is looming on the horizon. Today and before it is too late, you have to understand that this explosion will spare neither east nor west and will take us back to the dark ages. The war is in front of you, and Resolutions 1701 and 2735 are in your drawers. The choice is yours. Will your august Council intervene swiftly and decisively to silence the drums of war threatening the Middle East, or will we stand idly looking? The choice is yours, and you have to choose between peace and fire. I am here to repeat this call for the third time. We are amidst a conflict, and I repeat, give peace a chance. Give peace a chance before it is too late. Didn't Israel get enough wars, conflicts, killing, and destruction? Isn't it time to end our suffering, to sow the seeds of a better future for our peoples, and to spare future generations from this conflict? Thank you, President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Bo Habib for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Once again, I sit here in this council as I did on Monday, Thursday, and now Friday, defending Israel's right to exist, to defend ourselves. Also on Tuesday and Wednesday, we sat at the General Assembly for 2 days watching the Israel-bashing circus led by the Palestinian Authority as part of their diplomatic terrorism. Are there no other conflicts in the world? Are there no other pressing matters that require this Council's attention? Or is the UN's obsession with condemning Israel so consuming that it blinds you to everything else? We did not seek this war. We did not. On October 8th, while Israeli civilians were still being slaughtered in the south by Hamas, Hezbollah, I haven't heard you, Mr. Minister, mentioning Hezbollah even once in your speech. Hezbollah unleashed hundreds of rockets at our civilians in the north. This was not provoked. It was a calculated assault to show support for Hamas, a declaration made by Hassan Nasrallah himself. Since that day, over 8,000 rockets have rained down, 46 of our people have been murdered, 294 injured, and more than 60,000 remained displaced, unable to return to their homes in the north as Hezbollah attempts to burn them to the ground. Every day, Hezbollah's rockets deliberately target our civilians, attempting to destroy homes and force entire communities to flee in fear. Families have been torn apart. 12 Israeli Druze children who were playing soccer one moment were dead the next. And still, the terror continues every day. Where was the international community? Human rights? Nowhere. Every day, rockets, missiles, drones. Hezbollah's relentless attacks have forced innocent civilians, parents, children, the elderly, to abandon everything. They are now refugees within their own country, living in temporary shelters, unsure of when or if they will ever return to the places they once called home. This is not just the displacement of individuals, but of entire lives, memories, and futures. It has been nearly a year since they were forced to flee, and still they wait for the day when it will be safe to return. Israel will not allow this to continue. Our objective is very clear. We will restore security to our northern border, and we will bring our people home. It is our responsibility. The goal of returning our displaced citizens has been formally included in the objectives of this war. We will do whatever it takes to achieve this, and we will not allow Hezbollah's terror to dictate the future of our nation. If Hezbollah does not retreat from our border and back to the north of the Litani River through diplomatic efforts, Israel will be left with no choice but to use any means within our rights to defend our citizens and enable the evacuees of the north to return to their homes. Hezbollah has turned southern Lebanon into a war zone, using civilian homes as weapons depots and UNIFIL bases as launch points, digging tunnels beneath them and using innocent civilians as well as UN peacekeepers as the human shields. This is not just an attack on Israel. It is a crime against Lebanon itself. Hezbollah has brought untold suffering, not just to Israelis, but to the Lebanese people, who are also trapped in the grip of this terrorist organization. If this modus operandi sounds familiar, it is because the same is used by another terror organization, Hamas, also using civilians. Yet, the Lebanese foreign minister who sits here today could not find the courage to even mention Hezbollah. We know that is a problem. If we will sit together, we can achieve very fast agreements about everything. I'm not familiar with occupation of Israel in Lebanon. I'm not familiar with these major disputes. We can sit with your help and achieve some kind of a compromise. But we know that the real problem is not Lebanon. The real problem is Hezbollah. It is his government, after all, that bears the responsibility. They are incapable of implementing Security Council resolutions, nor preventing terrorist organizations from dragging their entire country into war. Minister Abdallah Abu Habib, Your Excellency, you have allowed a terrorist organization to create a state within your state, bringing ruin to your own people. Instead of blaming us, your peaceful neighbors, you should take action now to restrain Hezbollah and avoid greater escalation. If you continue to ignore Hezbollah's aggression, the pain and the suffering of the Lebanese people will be on your shoulders. Mr. President, while Israel is not seeking a wider conflict, I will be clear, we will not allow Hezbollah to continue its provocations. Their actions violate international law, and Israel will defend itself. We will not allow our people to live under constant threat, nor will we allow Hezbollah to use Lebanese territory as a launchpad for violence. For too long, we have called on this Council to enforce Resolutions 1701 and 1559. For too long, our calls have been ignored. For years, Israel has supplied data on Hezbollah's buildup in clear violation of Council resolutions, but to no avail. Hezbollah and its Iranian puppet masters must face real consequences for their actions. Hezbollah must be disarmed, and Iran must be held accountable for destabilizing the region. The world cannot afford to let Hezbollah's terror continue unchecked. We call on this Council to condemn Hezbollah and Iran and to designate Hezbollah and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as terrorist organizations. Words are no longer enough. This Council must act. For nearly a year, we have exercised restraint. We did, waiting for a diplomatic solution. And this is what we would prefer. We prefer, and we urge you, and we're thanking those who are trying to help this process. That's what we want. We have no desire for war, but we cannot continue to allow our people to bleed, nor can we abandon the 60,000 Israelis who have fled their homes. The outcome of this situation is clear. Hezbollah will be pushed back from the border, exactly as stated in Resolution 1701. The question that remains before us is how this will be achieved and at what cost. The devastation caused by Hezbollah's actions goes beyond human lives. Over 800 fires have been ignited by Hezbollah's rockets, burning more than 50,000 acres of forests, nature reserves, and agricultural land. Entire ecosystems have been destroyed. This is not just an environmental disaster. It is an act of war against the land itself. And yet, where is the UN? Where are the voices of condemnation for those who claim to care so deeply about the environment? The UN is about to convene its summit of the future. We know that climate and the environment are central themes, but where is the concern for the fires Hezbollah has set? Where is the outrage for the destruction of our forests, your forest in Lebanon? UN officials cannot even mention Hezbollah in their statements. This hypocrisy cannot go unchallenged. As I stated just 24 hours ago, Iran is the real instigator behind all of this. Hezbollah does not act alone. It is a puppet, and Iran is pulling the strings. Iran arms them, funds them, and directs their operations. Iran's influence stretches far beyond our borders, from Lebanon to Syria, from Yemen to Iraq. If Gaza could have been the Singapore of the Middle East, Beirut should have been the Paris of the Middle East. But we see that wherever Iran is involved, chaos and destruction inevitably follow. Mr. President, Israel will do whatever is necessary to protect its citizens. We will bring our displaced people back to their homes in the north. We will restore security, and we will bring calm to our nation. This is our right, and we will exercise it fully. The Security Council should stand by Israel as we seek to accomplish this, because this is not just Israel's fight. It is a fight against terrorism, against instability, and against the forces that seek to destroy peace in the region. When the time comes, do not look to us for blame in protecting our people. Now is your time to speak up and act before we have to. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you. In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, thank you, Mr. President, for convening this emergency meeting. We thank Lebanon and Algeria for requesting this meeting. We also thank Ms. DiCarlo and Mr. Turk for their briefing. We welcome the presence of His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Abu Habib, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Immigrants of Lebanon, in this meeting. Mr. President, member of the Security Council, this meeting is requested to address systematic and provocative act of terror committed by occupying regime of Israel on September 17 and 18 in Beirut, Lebanon, as well as in a part of Syria, deliberately targeting innocent civilians, including children. The method of this barbaric attack was unprecedented, as it was covertly handheld communication device was deliberately detonated, resulting in loss of at least 37 civilian lives and injuring thousands more, most likely of them injured from their eyes, including Iran's ambassador. Despite concerns by international community, this regime continues its aggression against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Lebanon and Syria. Just this morning, an air strike targeted the residential areas in Zahia, a densely populated suburb of Beirut, causing civilians casualties and loss of life. Mr. President, targeting thousands of people across various age groups in densely populated area of Beirut, whatever in their home, streets, workplaces, or shopping centers, is a clear act of terrorism and a flagrant violation of international law, in particular international humanitarian human rights law and numerous resolutions of this body, especially resolution on the protection of civilians. These widespread and systematic crimes aimed at mass killing, severe suffering, and serious injury to civilians constitutes crimes against humanity. Reports suggest that Israel intended to kill at least 5,000 civilians, while some devices either undistributed or deactivated. The Israeli barbaric attack has left Lebanon hospitals and medical staff in an unprecedented state of emergency, and attacks have sparked widespread fear and panic across Lebanon. Undoubtedly, Israel bears full responsibility for the perpetration of such horrific crimes. The repercussions of this attack extend far beyond Lebanon's border. The targeting of communication devices in the heart of Beirut sends a clear message to the international community. Israel is willing to commit any crime, no matter how extreme, to violate and attack the sovereignty and security of countries in the region and threaten regional and international peace and security. The Islamic Republic of Iran condemns in the strongest terms these horrible and barbaric attacks. We extend our deepest condolences and sympathies to the people and the government of Lebanon and the families of the victims of this heinous terrorist attack. We wish a swift and full recovery to the injured and reaffirm our unwavering solidarity with our Lebanese brothers and sisters. Mr. President, the attack on our ambassadors is a blatant violation of international law and diplomatic norms. The protection of diplomatic personnel is a fundamental principle of international relations. The Israeli terrorist attack has flagrantly violated the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and 1973 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes against International Protected Persons, including diplomatic agents. We will rigorously pursue accountability for the attack on our ambassador in Lebanon. We reserve our right under international law to take all necessary measures to respond to this egregious violation. Unfortunately, this Council has remained silent in the face of ongoing Israeli aggression and illegal actions, including the attack on Iran's diplomatic mission in Syria on 1st April 2024. Now again, this regime has crossed a red line by targeting our ambassador. Mr. President, let us not forget that these atrocious crimes against the people of Lebanon are part of a broader pattern of aggressive policy by Israeli regime. The Islamic Republic of Iran has repeatedly warned about the serious repercussions of malicious activities of the Israeli regime in the region. For the sake of regional peace, security, and the so-called ceasefire talks, the Islamic Republic of Iran has consistently shown maximum restraint. However, Israeli atrocities, from the ongoing genocidal war against the Palestinian people and occupation of Palestinian territories, to illegal strike in Syria and Lebanon, on the attack on Iran diplomatic mission in Syria, and cowardly assassination of Palestine's former prime minister and the political leader of Hamas in Tehran, demonstrate an Israeli relentless commitment to destabilizing the region and threatening international peace and security. Mr. President, the gravity of Israeli atrocities against the people of Lebanon must be recognized not just as an attack on Lebanon, but as a threat to peace and security across the region. We must ask ourselves, how much longer will the international community allow such atrocious crime to go unchecked? For decades, Israel has engaged in a pattern of aggressive actions aimed at destabilizing the region, whether through military operation, sabotage, or direct attack on civilians. This continuous aggression endangers the peace and security of the Middle East, fueling cycles of violence and further entrenching conflict. Regrettably, the Security Council has failed in its duty to maintain international peace and security. Israel's malevolent activities are often overlooked or outright supported by certain Western nations. Unwavering political, military, and economic support provided to Israel by the United States and its allies emboldens this regime to continue its violations without fear of accountability. This unconditional support, coupled with the deliberate blocking of any international effort to hold Israel responsible, has created an environment of impunity. The international community must not ignore the role of the Western countries, in particular the United States and UK, play in enabling Israel's aggressions. These heinous crimes once again shown the Israeli leadership has no intention to adhering to international norms or the so-called ceasefire negotiations, frequently referenced by the United States in this Council as being near resolution. The international community, and particularly this Council, has a duty to confront not only the direct perpetrators of such crimes, but also those who provide them with the means and political cover to commit them. The failures of this body to hold Israel accountable has only emboldened the regime, allowing it to continue its aggressive and unlawful behavior. The Islamic Republic of Iran stands firmly with the government and the people of Lebanon, and we will not rest until those responsible for these atrocities are held accountable. We reaffirm our commitment to upholding the principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. However, it is incumbent upon this Council to act, to stand up for justice, for peace, and the protection of innocent civilians. In conclusion, Mr. President, I categorically reject the baseless accusation made by the representative of Israeli regime against my country. The representative of this terrorist regime, led by a notorious prime minister who is under arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court for the commission of war in Gaza, consistently relies on lies and disinformation to evade responsibility and to shift blame onto others. The very foundation of this regime is rooted in aggression, occupation, terror, and genocide. So nobody will take seriously these unfounded claims. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
السيد الرئيس أدلي بهذا البيان
Thank you, Mr.
باسم المجموعة
President.
العربية في الأمم المتحدة في
I
نيويورك.
deliver the statement on behalf of the Arab
وأشكركم
group
على
of the United
استجابتكم
Nations here in New
للطلب
York.
الذي
I wish
تقدمت
to
به
thank you for
الجزائر
having
الشقيقة العضو العربي في مجلس الأمن لعقد هذه الجلسة الطارئة في ضوء التصعيد الأخير في العدوان الإسرائيلي المتواصل على لبنان الشقيق منذ ما يقارب العام. وأرحب بمشاركة السيد وزير خارجية لبنان عبد الله أبو حبيب الموقر في هذه الجلسة. سيد الرئيس، لقد تعرض لبنان يومي الثلاثاء والأربعاء الماضيين إلى عدوان سبراني إسرائيلي استهدف آلاف المدنيين اللبنانيين في كافة أرجاء البلاد في توقيت واحد، وذلك من خلال تفجير آلاف أجهزة البيجر والأجهزة اللاسلكية، مما أسفر عن استشهاد 37 شخصاً وإصابة 3250 غيرهم. لا يزال المئات منهم في حالة حرجة. بارتكابه لهذه الجريمة النكراء صعد كيان الاحتلال الإسرائيلي من إرهابه بحق المدنيين اللبنانيين عبر استهدافهم وأسرهم داخل منازلهم وفي الأماكن العامة التي يرتادونها دون أي اعتبار لمبادئ القانون الدولي والقانون الدولي الإنساني وحقوق الإنسان والحد الأدنى للقيم الإنسانية والحضارية. السيد الرئيس، إن همجية كيان الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ليست بجديدة، فقد قام منذ نشأته على القتل والإرهاب وارتكاب المجازر والفظائع. إلا أن الجديد هو ما اتسم به العدوان الأخير من توظيف للتقنيات الحديثة المدنية التي وجدت لخدمة البشرية وخيرها ورفاهها واستخدامها للقتل الجماعي للمدنيين.
Manipulation of modern day technology, equipment that and devices that have been used for the well-being of people.
أجهزة عادية تستخدم لأغراض مدنية في مختلف القطاعات إلى قنابل موقوتة تقتل حامليها دون تمييز وتلحق بهم وبالمحيطين بهم إصابات بليغة.
For civilian purposes, used for civilian purposes in various sectors, and transformed these devices into ticking time bombs, killing those, holding them without any distinction, sowing devastation around them. In this way, generating tremendous suspicion vis-a-vis the reliability and the safety of communications devices. The authorities of the Israeli occupying power last month used cyber attacks to intercept air traffic, civilian air traffic,
شبكات الاتصالات والأجهزة الإلكترونية في المنشآت والمرافق الحيوية، وهي جرائم تؤكد جميعها استهتار إسرائيل بأرواح المدنيين وازدرائها للقانون الدولي والقانون الدولي الإنساني ومواثيق حقوق الإنسان. تدين المجموعة العربية بأشد العبارات العدوان الإرهابي الإسرائيلي على الشعب اللبناني الشقيق وتدعو لمساءلة مرتكبيه وتعرب عن تعازيها الخالصة للبنان حكومة وشعبا ولأسر الضحايا وتمنياتها بالشفاء العاجل للجرحى، كما تعرب المجموعة العربية عن تضامنها الكامل مع لبنان ودعمه في مقاومته وتصديه للعدوان الإسرائيلي المتواصل الذي يهدد أمنه واستقراره ويلقي بأعباء إضافية على لبنان في الوقت الذي يواجه فيه تحديات كبيرة في قطاعات مختلفة بما فيها القطاع الصحي. تطالب المجموعة العربية مجلس الأمن بإدانة هذا الإرهاب السبراني الإسرائيلي والعدوان المتواصل على لبنان الشقيق
Israeli cyber-terrorism, this ongoing aggression against the brotherly Lebanese people, which is part and parcel of the acts of genocide that are being perpetrated, ethnic cleansing, as well as systematic violations of international law being perpetrated by the Israeli occupying entity against the Israeli Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And we condemn aggressions against countries in the region, including Syria. The Arab group reiterates that Israeli acts of aggression will
عن التمسك بحقوقها المشروعة والمكفولة
will not
بموجب القانون
stymie
الدولي
the desire,
وتحرير أراضيها المحتلة.
the commitment of our people to
كما
our
تطالب
attachment
المجموعة
to the
العربية
legitimate rights
مجلس
to
الأمن
liberate territory.
بتحمل
We
مسؤولياته في
demand that
حفظ
the
السلم
Security
والأمن
Council
الدوليين
meet
ووقف
its
العدوان
responsibility for the
بشكل
maintenance
فوري
of international peace and
ووضع
security.
قراراته
And we
ذات الصلة
demand an
موضع
end for it to
التطبيق
demand an end
لإنهاء
to this
الاحتلال
aggression, for the Security
الإسرائيلي
Council
للأراضي
to
العربية في
enforce the
فلسطين
relevant
وسوريا
resolutions to
ولبنان
end the Israeli
وتحمل
occupation of
كيان
Arab territories
الاحتلال
in Palestine,
الإسرائيلي
Syria, and
المسؤولية
Lebanon.
الكاملة
The
عن أي
Arab
تصعيد
group
إضافي للأوضاع في المنطقة
holds the
يهدد
Israeli
بجابها إلى
occupying
حرب
entity
إقليمية.
as fully accountable for any escalation, any situation that results in full-blown
السيد الرئيس
war in the region. Mr.
اسمحوا لي
President,
بالإدلاء بالملاحظات التالية
I
بالصفة
now
الوطنية.
wish to
ينضم
deliver
وفد
the
بلاد
following
سوريا
remarks in my
لبيان المجموعة
national
العربية
capacity. The Syrian
وتدين
delegation
سوريا
aligns itself
العدوان
with a statement
والإرهاب
of the Arab
الإسرائيلي
group.
المتواصل على لبنان
Syria
الشقيق
condemns
بما في ذلك
the
الإرهاب
aggression
السبراني
and the ongoing
الذي
terrorism
أدى لاستشهاد
against
العشرات
the
وإصابة
Lebanese people,
آلاف
including
غيرهم
cyber-terrorism, which claimed the
من
lives of
بينهم
dozens,
السفير الإيراني في
injuring
لبنان
thousands, including
كما تدين بلادي
the
العدوان الهمجي الذي
Iranian
استهدف اليوم
ambassador to
الضاحية
Lebanon.
الجنوبية السكنية في العاصمة اللبنانية
We
بيروت وأسفر
also
عن
condemn
استشهاد
the
14
barbaric
شخصا
aggression which targeted the
من بينهم
south suburbs
عدد
of
من
Beirut, claiming the lives of 12 people,
وإصابة
including
66 آخرين.
children, which resulted in
تؤكد سوريا
66 people being
تضامنها
wounded.
القوي مع الشعب
Syria
اللبناني الشقيق
reaffirms
ووقوفها إلى
its
جانبه
full
وتدعو
solidarity
جميع دول
with
العالم
the fraternal
وشعوبها
Lebanese
إلى
people.
إدانة
And
العدوان
we call
الإسرائيلي على
upon
لبنان
all peoples
والتحرك
throughout the
لوقفه
world to condemn the Israeli aggression against
ومساءلة
Lebanon
سلطات
and to
الاحتلال
act to put
الإسرائيلي عن
an end
جرائمها
to this.
كما
And
تحمل
to
سوريا
demand
الدول
accountability
الداعمة
for
لإسرائيل
the
وفي
authorities,
مقدمتها
the occupying
الولايات
authorities for the crimes
المتحدة
perpetrated.
المسؤولية عن
Furthermore,
إمعان كيان الاحتلال
we believe
في أعماله
that
العدوانية
states supporting
وجرائمه
Israel,
الوحشية
the United States,
وكذلك عن
first and
منع مجلس
foremost,
الأمن
shoulder
من
full
الاطلاع
responsibility
بمسؤولياته في حفظ السلم والأمن الدوليين
for the ongoing
والتصدي
Israeli
للتهديد
occupation, its acts of
الذي
aggression,
يمثله
its
كيان
barbaric
الاحتلال
crimes, as well as
لهما.
obstruction at the Security Council, preventing the Security
سيد
Council
الرئيس
from
ختاما
upholding its responsibility
هناك
to
سبب
counter
جذري
threats
واحد
posed by the
لما
occupying
تشهده
power,
المنطقة
threats
العربية
to
من عدم
international peace and
استقرار
security. To
ألا وهو
conclude,
استمرار
there
الاحتلال
is
الإسرائيلي للأراضي العربية
a
المحتلة
single reason
في
for the
فلسطين
instability in the region, that is the
والجولان
Israeli
السوري
occupation of Arab
وجنوب
lands in
لبنان.
Palestine, in the Syrian
إن أطفال
Golan,
مجد
and
الشمس
in South Lebanon.
الذين يحاول
The Al
ممثل
Mashdal
الاحتلال
Shams,
المتاجرة بدمائهم
which
الطاهرة
the representative of
هم
the
أطفال
occupation
سوريون من أهالي الجولان العربي السوري
has tried to
المحتل
manipulate
وهم يتطلعون
and the history. These are
وأهاليهم
children who are Syrian children residing in the occupied Syrian
من
Golan, who
الجولان
aspire, as do their
ليعودوا
families,
إلى
to
وطنهم
live
سوريا.
freely.
والحل في المنطقة
For the
لا يكون إلا
Golan
بإنهاء
to
الاحتلال
return to
الإسرائيلي
Syria, the
ووضع حد
solution in the region
لممارساته
can
الإجرامية
only, the resolution
وانتهاكاته
in the region can
الممنهجة
only lie
للقانون
through
الدولي.
an end to the occupation,
شكراً سيد الرئيس.
Israel's cessation to its systematic violations of international law. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.